I'm so excited to be talking about Scarlett Decalcified because I've been worried about her bones and if she's drinking enough milk and having enough cheese.
We're gonna talk about comics from Devil's Due. It's something you wondered if Talking Joe would ever do. I guess we'll explain it all to you. Gonna take some time to read the books we've never read.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the G.I.Joe comics podcast. Today, we will be continuing our look at the Disavowed era of G.I. Joe with the one-shot comic G.I. Joe Scarlett Declassified from Devil's Due, September 2006. And with me, as always, most of the time, is my co-host. It's a real American redhead. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners. I was born a redhead.
So I'm sure you feel this kinship to Scarlett.
I think I feel a kinship to Snake Eyes. Don't we all feel like Snake Eyes?
I don't know.
We all feel like the world is against us.
Terribly disfigured.
We have to hide our true selves, and we secretly wish or believe we're the best at several things.
I don't know. So, if you are new to Talking Joe, you can find out all about us. It's a bit of a weird place to start, for just mention that. But welcome. You can find out all of the details over at our website. It is talkingjoe.co.uk. So we have reached the end of the Joe Casey era of America's elite, and we've just covered the Mike O'Sullivan two-parter, 19 and 20 of America's Elite, Emperor's New Clothes. So following that, we'll be digging into some of the non-America's Elite issues that came out during this period before we get back into America's Elite with 21 and the start of the Mark Powers writing era. So over the next few episodes, we will be covering Scarlett Declassified, which is this episode, Dreadnoks Declassified, Special Missions Antarctica and Brazil, G.I. Joe versus Transformers 3 and 4, before we loop back over to America's Elite. How's that prospect strike you, Tim?
Considering you and I had already agreed to it, it sounds good. But for making it sound like we just thought of it and we want our listeners in on our process and decision making, that sounds like a great idea, Mark.
Cool. Which out of that list do you think you're looking forward to looking at the most?
I'm ready to fall in love with G.I. Joe Declassified because it's Hama. I don't know that I will because I've tried a few times, but I have a soft spot for Black Horizon because Andrew Wildman came back. Mm-hmm.
See, I'd actually left out G.I. Joe Declassified from that list because it's sort of so distinct and so much its own thing that I felt like almost, do we just save that up for a special occasion?
Yes, I guess I wasn't listening when you rattled off that list. So listeners, you now know our full process. We make our decisions before we record, and then when Mark is talking, I don't listen.
So we're looking at Scarlett Declassified today, and that sort of fits into a quadrilogy of declassified series. Am I allowed to use that word, Tim?
That's a real word.
Very good. So we had Snake Eyes Declassified as issues 1 to 6, August 2005 through to January 2006. Dreadnoks Declassified was next, 1 to 3, covering January 2006 to May 2006. G.I. Joe Declassified 1 to 3, June 2006 through to October 2006. And Scarlett Declassified was basically the last of the bunch, September 2006. So for a little over a year, essentially, we had a declassified series coming out once a month as part of the overall G.I. Joe kind of package of what was on the shelves each month.
Yeah, it's do you remember there one of our anniversary episodes when we did is our trivia called Squidjuenjo, when we and guests of the show have trivia questions, and it was for our anniversary 150th episode or one of them, and wasn't one of the questions which publisher has published the most issues of G.I. Joe?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the question was asked of me, and I had to think about it for all of us, and I was thinking about it out loud, and I had to do some quick math that Devil's Due published a lot of G.I. Joe comics. It's really easy to count how many Marvel ones there were, because 155 plus 28 plus 4 and 4 and 1, and
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe you count European missions because it's still Marvel, and it's harder to count up all the Devil's Due stuff, but it adds up very quickly to almost the same amount. So,
Mm-hmm.
G.I. Joe fans had a lot of Joe comics to read in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah.
So, the story of Marvel and Devil's Due is that Marvel did publish more, but that was over 12 years. And Devil's Due had 7?
Right. Yeah. A sort of a more concentrated burst of G.I. Joe for the audience. All of those other declassified series were multi-part, generally sort of prestige offerings, and collected individually as trade paperbacks. Scarlett Declassified was a 48-page one-shot with a $4.95 cover price and was never collected as far as I know.
I believe that is correct. And I wonder if that, makes it informally the most sought after Devil's Due G.I. Joe comic. It also, because it looks so different than all of the other Devil's Due G.I. Joe comics, because it's a one shot, because there are, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, no variant covers.
Mm-hmm.
In my memory, and I think maybe in sort of people's sense of it, this almost feels like a lost Marvel issue, because it doesn't look like a Marvel issue, but it doesn't look like a Devil's Due issue. And in that it's a single issue, there's no variants. It feels more like a Marvel issue, sort of as an object.
Right.
So in my mind, I think once or twice when I've thought of my 2 long boxes, I guess I only have short boxes, my 3 short boxes of G.I. Joe comics, I think once or twice in my memory, I have sort of conflated this with G.I. Joe Declassified. And I've thought, oh yes, Scarlett Declassified. Didn't Hama write that? No.
And the reason that we're doing things slightly out of chronological order is because I wanted to group it together with our last issues of 19 and 20, which were written by Mike O'Sullivan, because he also wrote this issue. Which brings us over to the creative team. Writer is ... as you might guess, Mike O'Sullivan. Artist is Phil Noto. So that encompasses, I guess, all of the art: pencils, inks, colours. Letterer Brian J. Crowley. Military advisor Phil Kost. With a special thanks to Robert Rodi, who Mike O'Sullivan worked with on Special Missions Tokyo and Sigma 6, where he was the writer for those books. So potentially a sounding board or some advice on this issue, along with Brian Torney, who I think also has a writing credit in The Hunt for Cobra Commander, as well as Mark and Patti O. So I guess those are relatives. And with gratitude and appreciation to Larry Hama, for obvious reasons, because essentially he was the man behind Scarlett in the previous comics and the inspiration for this one.
Let's have a look at the covers in the gallery.
Okay, this cover is penciled and inked and colored by Phil Noto, and it is striking for several reasons. Both the background and Scarlett's hair and some of her crossbow and her shoulder pad and her glove are all red. And they're all just about the same red. She is separated from the background. This is a close-up. This is her head and her shoulder and one hand. She's holding up her weapon. I don't know if this is on purpose or inadvertently, but this cover looks back to the Mike Zeck Marvel cover for G.I. Joe 54, the Marvel 25th anniversary border cover with Snake Eyes, head and shoulder, holding up his Uzi with the yellow background. And Scarlett is looking right at us, and she's a little bit off to the side. And so she's cropped a little bit, her head, her weapon's cropped a little bit, her hand is cropped a little bit. And I am generally a fan of story and action covers where you have a scene that asks a question, and you will learn the answer to the question by reading the comic inside. Another way of phrasing that might be sort of it's a tease image, or there's some kind of risk or cliffhanger, like two heroes are on top of a ledge and one of them is falling, or one of them is holding on to the ledge, or, something like that. And though I certainly like handsome drawings of cool characters, I'm less interested in just portraits, just, Batman's head or Darth Vader's head or Scarlett's head looking at us. But there are certainly really talented comic artists out there who put a lot of personality into just one face sort of looking at us, the reader, or maybe past or over to the left or over to the right. And because there are so many story elements in this issue, it might be hard to pick, the one that makes for the best cover. Like I don't need to see her like scaling the wall, like the cover to Special Missions 15. No, it's 18. The Ron Wagner one where Snake Eyes is scaling the wall. Sorry. I think this is a really good use of a portrait of a character with no story and no background context. I'm always ready to point out when artists don't draw backgrounds. I think they mostly should draw backgrounds. I'm not looking at this cover and thinking, I really need to see part of the villain's base here, or like, I really need to see the Statue of Liberty in the background here. This is a really striking cover. And in fact, there are kind of actually only two colors on this cover, because everything is red, including basically her complexion. And then everything else is blue-green, which is her tunic, parts of her weapon, and her eyes. This is also striking because we have never before, and I think never since, on a G.I. Joe cover, seen a logo type for the name, for the title, Scarlett, right? Just as, when Snake Eyes Declassified was published, we had seen a title logo type for Snake Eyes when the Marvel book got sort of retitled around issue 135, when it, with the trading cards. But, G.I. Joe's always been this team book, and you tend not to get character names on the covers, and you almost never get a comic named after the character when it can just be called G.I. Joe. So,
in fact, ironically, issue 143, which is called Dark Island, which is that inventory issue, which is mostly just a Scarlett solo issue,
right, is
also called G.I. Joe starring Snake Eyes.
Right. Is that the second to last issue?
It's 143.
Second to last issue, where the cover says G.I. Joe featuring Snake Eyes as opposed to G.I. Joe. And then I guess my last observation about the cover is that on the bottom right under the credits, Phil Noto, who gets top credit. It's not writer and then artist, right? And most of the time, there were some exceptions at Image Comics and Extreme Studios in particular. There were some times in the 90s when like the artist got named first or only the artist. DC had an initiative. DC Comics had an initiative 5 years ago where there were a bunch of new series. That's when Jim Lee was doing covers for that book called, was it The Immortals? And Andy Kubert did that new Challengers of the Unknown. Anyway, but there was a brief time recently where DC specifically had artists plotting the books and the artist's name went first. Anyway, here on the cover of Scarlett Declassified 1, it says Phil Noto, Mike O'Sullivan, and then it says 48 fabulous pages with 3 exclamation marks. And I hope Mark, when you post this episode, you will find ways to incorporate not 0, not 1, but 3 exclamation marks into the episode title or the YouTube file, or if this ends up on YouTube or on Facebook. I really like this cover.
I think what it will be Talking Joe featuring Mark and Tim Finn! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark.
I think more accurate it would be Talking Joe. Oh no, featuring 2 fabulous hosts! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, Mark and Tim. Phil Noto, maybe I skipped the obvious. Phil Noto draws attractive and alluring characters, both men and women. They are good-looking people. What I like about this cover is that this is a capable and confident character who is also an attractive character that a lot of people really like. This is not, and I know that Devil's Due was really sort of hemmed in by Hasbro on how, suggestive or sexy, whether on purpose or not, characters like the Baroness or Zanya could be on their covers. This is not like just some random pinup of Scarlett where she's like standing on the balls of her feet and sticking her butt out for no reason, which every so often that kind of cover shows up with female G.I. Joe characters. This is a confident, cool, calm, deadly expert.
Cool. And interestingly, on the inside front cover, there is a full body shot of Scarlett, which unusually seems to have been created. Well, actually, I'll dial back. Unusually, this images only appears on this inside front cover. Doesn't seem to be taken from anywhere else. Possibly it might have been created as some like promo art, or maybe a draft front cover before they decided to go with slightly more intense close-up.
I had thought maybe this is art that they had Phil Noto draw to send to Hasbro to get approval, or maybe a warm-up drawing Phil Noto did before he did this book. It does, a small portion of it does appear inside just her head and shoulders when at the Pentagon, two brass are looking at a computer monitor.
Right.
Okay. But yes, I had remarked the same thing. Hey, cool pinup. We haven't seen that before, but it does feel like a lost data desk or Battle Files pinup drawing.
Cool. We've been talking about Phil Noto a lot, so let's maybe just let's sort of kind of tie that in a bow with and linger on it a little bit. So he is a pretty big artist, pretty prolific as well in terms of both interiors and cover art. Sort of looking through some of his credits includes Star Wars Poe Dameron, Birds of Prey, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Black Widow, Astonishing X-Men, Immortal X-Men, Star Wars The High Republic, Cable, X-Men Gold, Star Wars Yoda. What else have we got? Uncanny X-Force, Jonah Hex, Batgirl. He does some great work on that. Thunderbolts, Daredevil, Solo, a Star Wars story. So quite a lot of work and quite varied. But I think this is pretty early on in his career still at this point on Scarlett. Yeah.
It's funny. I don't remember, as we're recording this, when I was first aware of Phil Noto. I'd have to, based on your list just now, do some Googling and think about it. I'm trying to remember when his Infinite Horizon miniseries was with Jerry Dugan. But this Scarlett issue predates most of that list that you just read out. But I remember, importantly to today's episode, when this comic was announced, I thought, oh, wow, Devil's Due has got someone awesome on this issue. And I'm going to buy this issue. So it's cover dated July 2006. So we're a hair less than 5 years into Devil's. So we're 2/3 of the way through Devil's Due having and making G.I. Joe, I had, bought the comic at the beginning and then checked out, and then come back once to try it again and then checked out. And I, signed me up for a one-shot drawn by someone really good, because as I have said in previous episodes and will say in future episodes, the Declassified project did not satisfy me artistically. I mean, in terms of art drawing. And Phil Noto, even in 2006, because he's only gotten better, this was a real cool surprise and a real, Devil's Due got Phil Noto on this one comic. And what a good fit, because Scarlett is this attractive character who's really capable, and Phil Noto draws good-looking women without making them too, shiny and skinny and curvy and exploitive and distracting. And so I bought this at the time, and I was excited. And I remember also being surprised that it was just a one-shot. Wouldn't they want to make this a little bigger? Doesn't this want to be a 3-issue miniseries? Okay, so Phil Noto, in addition to all the comics work that you've done, that you've mentioned, it is important to note that he is also very much branched out. He has done book covers. There are some Star Wars novels that he's done the covers for. And that may be a lateral move, because if you're drawing for Marvel and you draw some Star Wars issues and covers, maybe someone over at Lucasfilm says, oh, that guy's good. We should get that guy to do some book covers. Let's put him in touch with the book people. I don't know, maybe Phil Noto pitched himself, maybe an editor noticed his work. Phil Noto also has done, didn't he do the DVD or the Blu-ray cover for Solo, a Star Wars story, when that movie, and again, that might just be another, I don't mean to say just, doing a DVD cover is huge. That might be a lateral move when you've already done comics and Star Wars comics. Doing Star Wars art for other licensed products may not be a big stretch, but
it's the future and wiser Mark here, just interjecting with a comment which for some extraordinary reason I neglected to mention at the time, which is that outside of comics, Phil Noto also, of course, did the box art to the Scarlett Classified toy. So he's done Scarlett Declassified art and also Scarlett Classified. Clearly, the good folks at Hasbro saw his Scarlett art on this series and any other Scarlett art of his that might have popped up on the old interwebs, and thought that he would be a primo candidate for doing the Classified box art back in the day in that very first wave of G.I. Joe Classified. Back over to Tim, who I'm sure is going to say something extraordinarily insightful right about now.
One of the many things I like about Phil Noto's work is that he stays in comics, he comes back to comics, and he does a lot of comics. Before we get into the meat of this Scarlett special, so Phil Noto, you mentioned in your list, he drew the most recent Cable series, which ran for 1 year and launched in the sort of second wave of post House of X, 2019, 2020, like X-Men comics. And I read that whole series. It was okay. Toy fans, take note, Rom does not show up in that Cable series, but some other Space Knights, and I think Rom's sword? Anyway, does. There's some weapon that Rom... Anyway, Phil Noto, while he was doing that Cable series, the pandemic hit 8 months after House of X and this big Jonathan Hickman-led X-Men relaunch. A year into that whole relaunch, there was going to be this big 2-month X-Men crossover called X of Swords. Two of the artists who were working on the monthly X titles lived in, and I think still live in, Italy, which was hit really hard by the pandemic. And so the editors were sort of moving some people around to keep the trains running on time. And Phil Noto ended up drawing, I think, 2, maybe 3 fill-in issues during the X of Swords crossover, besides the monthly Cable comic that he was doing. And they looked like kind of rush jobs, but they were still quite good. And no one has ever said this, but sort of seeing how he draws and seeing when he draws something full out, like a Star Wars cover or these unbelievable Marvel 80th anniversary variant covers. He did 9 of them a couple years back, and they like connect and they all sort of make a poster, and they remind me of Drew Struzan's compositions for the Star Wars Special Edition posters from 1997. That was a long sentence. I lost my thread. Phil Noto, he can paint and go all out. He can draw and color and go sort of medium out, like his Black Widow series, which is quite good. And he can also, in a rush, I think when an editor gives him a brief deadline, knock out a pretty good looking comic where he's taking some smart shortcuts and not doing a lot of like crowd scenes and, like detail and intense perspective. And he's spotting a lot of blacks. He can still, I get the sense that he's very fast or can be.
Speaking of very fast, let's talk about the inside of this comic book very quickly in a plot breakdown.
Plot breakdown.
Scarlett recounts her origin stories to Snake Eyes on the Staten Island ferry. Scarlett learned martial arts starting at age 9. She went into college at an Ivy League school. She passed the bar and became a lawyer. She entered the army, proved herself in combat. She impresses General Austin and General Flagg, who pull strings to get her into the FBI Academy. On an undercover mission in Ireland, she meets a pre-Cobra Destro. The mission goes wrong, but Hawk recruits Scarlett onto his counter-terrorist team, Group Delta, aka G.I. Joe. Where to start? I feel like we talk about Phil Noto's art a lot, so I don't want to linger too long on it, but it is the most striking thing about this issue. It's, striking is the word. It looks very different to most of what we have seen from Devil's Due before. A lot of the line work is quite simple, which it probably is in part because he's doing everything himself. He knows how he can then sort of color to make the simple lines pop via the color treatments. It looks almost animated in places, but sort of not overly fussy. I guess use of color is used to differentiate scenes, places, flashbacks, eras. And sort of very appealing, like the art a lot. A couple of places where it looks slightly stranger is probably on the big splash pages where perhaps that simpler line art looks slightly strange or slightly, find me an adjective, Tim.
Like unfinished or not fully considered? Like empty?
There's sort of an emptiness to it, but also there's a sort of an imprecision to some of the lines, like where they meet and so on.
Yes.
It's sort of...
All right, so I'll pick up that and run backwards. All right, so if you're looking at the first page, splash page, Scarlett looking at us, asking a question, just to the left of her ear, there are two sort of twirly black lines which show the folds of her hair, and they converge where the red of her hair touches the blue of the sky, and the line goes past the edge just a tiny bit, or these two lines in her ear go past the line for her hair just a tiny bit. And I think when other artists do that more, we might call it sketchy. When Phil Noto, who is such a clean and precise artist, does it, it looks slightly, again, an adjective, like slightly mistaken, slightly messy, but those are both negatives, and I don't really see it that way. What I see is he's drawing with great confidence and with some speed, and so he is a tiny bit stylized and messy and sketchy because he can get away with it. And sometimes when you're drawing, like, the extra 5 or 10% of work you can do to clean up something takes 30% of the time. And doesn't buy you 30% more appreciation from the reader, or 30% more dollar value in higher price if you sell the art. And so, what I'm trying to say is, an artist like this can make small compromises all over the place because he's making decisions based on a lot of skill in anatomy and design. And what looks a tiny bit sketchy to us is him just sort of like skipping it along and moving on to the next thing. And I start to wonder when I look at this first page, I think, oh, maybe this was drawn digitally.
Could be. Hey, it's Future and Wiser Mark here again. This page happens to be on comicartfans.com website, so we know that it actually exists as an ink-on-paper original.
Another thing that you were just talking about is color, that this doesn't look like Devil's Due books. And that is because Noto's art is open. He doesn't spot blacks. Sort of the only blacks here are
from leather
Scarlett's
jackets. Yeah.
Yes, Scarlett's black nighttime costume, the Iron Grenadiers on some of the pages. There are no black ink shadows on this first page, sort of under her chin or under her jaw or like under her turtleneck collar. He might do that with color, or he might just not do it at all. And what Noto is doing in this comic is he's drawing with the clear line style, right? And if you have read a lot of mainstream comics in the last 30 years, sort of the nearest neighbor for this is Steve Dillon, who drew a lot of Punisher, a little bit of Ultimates and Wolverine for Marvel. And before that, of course, did Preacher at DC. And some of his Punisher was inked by Jimmy Palmiotti and has a little less of this. But when Dillon inks himself, he has died. When Dillon inked himself, he did not change the line weight. He did not go from thin to thick. His line, whatever he was drawing, however far something was from the, quote, camera, was always the same weight, always the same thickness. And Noto is basically doing that here. There are some small differences, but he's not really doing them for effect. I think they're sort of inadvertent. And the clear line style comes from Hergé drawing Tintin. And if you think of Tintin, everything, no matter where it is, no matter how detailed or big or far or close, has the same line width, and everything is colored flat. And so when a comic like this, Scarlett, does this style, it looks back to that, even if Phil Noto isn't specifically, doing an Hergé style.
Interestingly, Phil Noto did pick up working on the Thunderbolts series. This is the Marvel Now Thunderbolts, following Steve Dillon, who I think did the first 6 issues, and then Phil Noto, I believe, did 7 through to pretty much 13.
Was this the series where like everyone had something red on them?
That's
like
right. Yeah.
Punisher now had a red skull, and like it was the Red Hulk and Elektra and Deadpool or someone.
That's right.
Okay, so that's a neat observation that these two artists are much more similar than you might think in how they draw. There's also something else that they have in common, which relates to how I would talk about this Scarlett comic. Both Steve Dillon, and this is all over his Punisher and Preacher, and Phil Noto draw a lot of straight on 1 point perspective shots where a character is looking straight at you and the thing behind them is a wall, and the wall is not angling away from us. If they were to back up, their back would be against the wall. So we are perpendicular to the wall. We're looking flat straight at the wall or the door or the window. And I have called out some artists who have drawn other G.I. Joe comics on this podcast for doing that too much, and I call it a weakness. I stand by that. And I do see it as a limitation of Phil Noto. I think in some ways he is miscast to draw a G.I. Joe comic, because a G.I. Joe comic is about action and dynamic action as much as it is about, confident characters and cool costumes. And I think even if you don't really analyze comics and comic art, I think if you read this Scarlett comic, you sort of pick up on the fact that the action here is a little tepid. it's not super dynamic. There isn't a lot of oomph to it, like just look at any Conan cover by John Buscema, and this is not that. Steve Dillon, in some ways, was a really odd choice to draw so much Punisher, and I think he and Garth Ennis were a package deal because, the editor who's it's like who's picking out the team to fix Punisher in 1999 or 2000 thinks who's a good writer for the guy who did Preacher. Like, well, that guy could draw it. So considering how much action and like running and jumping and lunging and throwing and bad guys being thrown and explosions there are going to be in like 10 years of Punisher comics, Steve Dillon is not actually the right artist for that. And yet he always managed to pull it off, not with a lot of oomph and aplomb, but always with great clarity. And he would always pick maybe not the most dramatic camera angle, but he was never like drawing someone's hand when you needed to see like a whole person picking up a guy. But he wouldn't draw Punisher holding a guy over his head, like with the camera on the ground looking up, like some Jack Kirby Hulk, powerful dynamic shot. He would draw, Frank Castle like standing 5 feet right in front of us, not up, down, or left, right. And Phil Noto does the same thing. There are many, many panels and pages in this where Phil Noto draws Scarlett and all of the other characters either straight on or centered in the panel or straight on and centered in the panel. The reason why I'm okay with this is because everything I see in how Phil Noto draws, he's doing it as a conscious choice and as someone who understands design. And there are younger and less developed artists who do it, and I see it as a limitation. And I'll just throw in one more comparison, and then I'll hand the microphone back to you. If just one more artist who does this a lot, who centers characters and has them often looking straight on at us, is Frank Quitely. Just look at the first 20 pages of All-Star Superman, or if you have the 12 issues, just look at the first issue. He is very often putting characters in the center, and if he's got two panels in a tier, he's oftentimes cutting it right down the middle, panel 1 and panel 2. And he's someone who does draw a lot of 2 and 3 point perspective, and who can do a lot of more dynamic camera angles and action. And I remember when Phil Noto signed up to do that Black Widow run, and I remember thinking, okay, cool, he'll get the spy stuff. I don't know if he'll pull off the action. And it did represent a small leveling up for him. I looked at that series, and it was still not the most dynamic Black Widow we've ever seen, but more dynamic action than Noto had done in his previous stuff.
Good, yeah, I've got that one. Seek It Out, along with the Chris Samney arc.
Oh yeah,
as well.
Oh my God, that's the Mark Waid Chris Samney Black Widow. Oof, wow.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting observation there. And as you were talking, I was sort of flicking through, and once you know to look for it, the number of sort of straight on, particularly looking directly at us panels, it's numerous.
Can I say one last thing about it?
Go on.
Phil Noto, one of his influences is Robert McGinnis. Robert McGinnis is best known. He's done a bunch of stuff. He's best known for painting James Bond movie posters. And like the Breakfast at Tiffany's poster. And if you look at those posters, characters are looking straight on at us. And there's often, as movie posters have been, a montage of heads and torsos and elements and props. So one of the reasons why I'm so okay with Phil Noto, his drawing being so flat, is that he's taking that as an influence from a master of illustration. If you go to Comic Art Fans, there is a Phil Noto page from Danger Girl Viva Las Danger. And I guess it's page 11. It's from 2003. And Phil Noto the original art is penciled, and then it's very quickly colored. The characters are colored in like 1 or 2 Copic markers. And then I think like scanned and then colored separately. And it's someone at a slot machine. And you can see both of these things. You can see not only Phil Noto having characters sort of flat and straight on, but also you can see some like James Bond poster in this sort of multi-composition. Okay, microphone back to you, Mark.
Okay, so my main observation around the story art aside is probably around the story structure, which is a flashback within a flashback within a flashback. So we're flashing back to the early days of G.I. Joe, where Scarlett is getting to know Snake Eyes and having that conversation with him on a ferry, and I guess we would infer that this is from the story in G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero issue 27, Snake Eyes: The Origin Part 2, where there is that sequence where they're on the ferry, flashing back to the ferry, and Scarlett is talking about Snake Eyes, telling him all about his life, and actually, the story ends on the beat that Scarlett has told Snake Eyes her story. So now tell me yours, which is where he kind of reveals to Scarlett all of his past, and tells her that he likes her because he reminds her of his sister, which makes her grumpy. But I'm getting distracted. And actually, sorry, as well, now tell me yours. In my custom bound book of the Declassified series, I have Scarlett starting it off and then Snake Eyes Declassified, because essentially this closes out with the question, let me hear about Snake Eyes' origin, which is essentially what Snake Eyes Declassified is. So we're talking about the flashback structure. So we're sort of flashing back to the early days of G.I. Joe on this ferry. Then we're flashing back to a mission on Ireland. And then in the middle of the action sequence, she near as damn it says, I suppose you're wondering how I got into this situation. And then actually says, I guess I should really start at the beginning. Then we're flashing back to her childhood, and we're walking forward from her childhood, her studies, her FBI training, to the mission in Ireland, whereupon we then flash forwards, slightly forward again to where we were on the previous flashback on Ireland, but with certain elements of it seeming a bit discombobulated. I'll get back to that in a minute. So I think this is there's a fairly simple story here, and I think it's made muddled and confused by the flashback structure, and I think it introduces potential for some of it being less impactful and also more confusing, and potentially even errors in there. So why I say less impactful is that there's a moment where there's like a reveal of Destro. So Destro is sort of skulking in the shadows. This is the page where Scarlett is being knocked out by the two guys in the leather jackets, and Destro is in is a silhouette, black silhouette in the shadows, and mysterious. We can't see his face, but on earlier on in the book, on page 10ish, we see Destro very clearly, gun drawn, coming at us before we then flash back into time. So having Destro in the shadows as a mystery in terms of how this sequencing works, later on in the book isn't a mystery, because we've already had the reveal. We already know it's Destro. So in part, I wonder whether maybe the original plotting was in a different order, and in the final edit, they might have moved things around to try and just make, I guess, the story more dynamic, more complex.
Yeah.
And I'll pause on like a bit of the confusion that I had around this, which is that at the start of the book, page 3, there are these guys running forward at the Iron Grenadiers, and they, shouting, "Get them freaking idiots!" in Irish brogue. "Get them freaking idiots!" And then, Scarlett breaks free. There's in the courtyard, there's her sort of teammates, as it were, Liam Morgan and Connor Murphy. They're, one of them is in a sort of greeny grey top, and one of them is in like a brown jacket. They have bruised and battered faces. One of them has got a cut on his face and a big red bruised eye. And then we go back into the past, but then when we cut forward to the present, later on, they don't have those sort of cuts on their faces any longer by the looks of things. And their costumes are sort of confusing because they don't have their black leather jackets on. So it's like they've sort of been established on this mission of all of these guys on the same team. They're sort of dressed in black. And then by removing their jackets, it's like, wait, hold on. Are these the same guys? And I've still no idea who those people on page 3 are, sort of running forward, shooting and shouting, get them freaking Egypts. I don't know. Extra IRA people that somehow got involved and turned up on the scene later on, because it'd been established that everyone was in black leather jackets on the mission later on in the book. Lots of thoughts there, Tim, and I'm basically just saying I think some of this is much more confusing than it needs to be, and it feels like harder work as a result. If it was just a little bit more start at the start, end at the end, I think it would have been easier to follow and a more enjoyable read.
Yes, I agree with you. When I was reading this, I was absorbing the art and the color a lot more and thinking about the story structure less. I was just sort of taking each scene, each time frame as it was, and not worrying about if they connected properly.
Right.
But
I think it was a bit like that for me as well. I was sort of like enjoying it and taking it all in, and each scene in its own right was like, okay, this is interesting. But then sort of trying to join the main, plot with this sort of present, well, not quite present day Irish scene. It just didn't. The pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to quite join up very easily for me.
Yeah, the thing that I was thinking about, less what was in the comic story and more how the comic story connects to other stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very aware in a nice way of, in the narration, sort of matching Scarlett's expertise in the story, what she's learning and where she goes, to her file card from the toy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And if you're going to write a comic about these characters, you should definitely consult and expand on, those 3 or 4 sentences that Larry Hama wrote and Kirk Bazigian edited down on the backs of the 82 packages. At the same time, it's sort of thankless, because if Mike O'Sullivan follows that, I'm going to say, add something. I already know this. And if he adds something, I'm going to say, don't add anything. Everything you need is right there. So I'm just a grumpy fan, and he can't satisfy me.
Yeah. So let's call out just for the record, the file card. So file card is Shana M. O'Hara, grade E5, birthplace Atlanta, Georgia, primary specialty intelligence, secondary specialty classified. Scarlett's father and 3 brothers were martial arts instructors. She began her training at age 9 and was awarded her first black belt at age 15, graduated Advanced Infantry Training and Ranger School, Special Ed, Covert Ops School, Marine Sniper School, Special Air Services School, Marine Taekwondo Symposium, qualified expert in lots of weaponry. So all of those beats are essentially sort of touched upon, and they've also called it in from the comic book and probably also the cartoon, I suspect. So the comic book created her sister Siobhan in where it was like issues 101, 102, where Scarlett was in a coma and she wanted to turn off the life support. So that she hadn't been touched on the file card, but so here's the 3 brothers mentioned on the file card, but also bringing in her sister from the comics, and I suspect also probably her brothers' names are touched on, and those might be drawn from Captives of Cobra. What can you tell us about Captives of Cobra, Tim?
Captives of Cobra is this wonderful 2-parter that aired in 85. So Cobra targets family members of like 6 or 7 different Joes, and that includes Scarlett's dad and her 3 brothers. In the show, her dad has white hair and a white beard and mustache, and her brothers have red and orange and brown hair. But they're at the O'Hara Martial Arts Dojo in Georgia, and Crimson Guards men and Storm Shadow show up, and other Cobra Joe family members are kidnapped, and then they're brainwashed by Cobra, and they put on these like anti-radioactivity protective suits, and they're sent to collect these like glowing crystals in the like desert. And in the cliffhanger at the end of part 1, the Joes are driving this crazy vehicle that looks like it wandered in from Inhumanoids. And they've got these crystals in the back, and they have to keep them very steady because if they move around or touch each other, they blow up. And the Joes look ahead, and they see blocking the desert road are these 15 brainwashed family members of them, the Joes, in these like silver Cobra, like look like underwater costumes because they've got like helmets and visors in the front and Cobra logos on them. Their eyes are glowing red, and the Joes don't know how to, what do? Do they surrender? Their family members are brainwashed. And anyway, it's a great two-parter. I don't remember if her brothers are named in the two-parter, and they are not named in this comic.
No, I was trying to have a look just now to see if I could spot any names. And her dad is wheelchair bound following a car accident in this issue, which is then later called back in, I think, G.I.Joe America's Elite, probably 19, where also written by Mike O'Sullivan, where she goes, they have, the Joes go on some leave, and she goes to visit her family. So this sort of plot point introduced here is sort of revisited.
You know what this comic might invent? Scarlett's mom, who isn't mentioned in the file card, and I'm fairly certain doesn't show up in the two-parter Captives of Cobra, and doesn't do anything here in this comic, but does show up, sort of in the background in 3 panels. I guess she watches her daughter do Taekwondo. I appreciate that if Mike O'Sullivan is going to have an origin for Scarlett's code name, he does it quickly and with a light touch. There's no, Scarlett doesn't like grab some weapon and make a big pronouncement. It's just these 3 dopey guys. It's half a page.
From this day forward, let me be known as Scarlett.
And lo, there shall be a code name. I appreciate that. I'm trying to think about sort of how I take writer Mike O'Sullivan's handling of her family. I think he does a good job because it is only a 40-page comic. It's got some ads. And we really want to see Scarlett doing her thing. So of her 5 family members, and it's not her mom and her sister. They're not really there. Her dad and her 3 brothers. It's really only her dad who sort of does anything, right? They have some dialogue at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. He goes through a change, right? He's a proud father and a stern teacher, but then also in one panel we see a car wreck and then he's in a wheelchair, and that is not explained any more than that, except that she feels guilty. And then he says, this is my new life and you have to accept it. I appreciate that there isn't really any room for like one of her brothers to like come up to her room and give her a pep talk, or like see her off, at the airport or the bus station. I think Mike O'Sullivan does a good job in these number of pages of giving Scarlett a lot of things to do, giving her dad a couple but important things to do. We get some G.I. Joe, continuity and touchstones. We see like a pre-issue 1 Destro. We see a pre-issue 1 and pre-issue 70-something Iron Grenadiers. We see, is it General Flag and who's the other? Austin. Generals Austin and Flag. We see them for a page. We see, is it Hawk and Stalker for 1 panel at the end?
We also see Sparks as well,
yes,
who's sort of established as...
Devil's Due's favorite G.I. Joe NPC. And then there's just enough of these sort of her partner on the mission and then their contact, who's sort of a bad guy, that when the mission goes south and both of them, her partner and their contact, who's kind of a bad guy, get, it's not clear, injured or killed, but let's say killed, that I think, oh, rats, how unfortunate for Scarlett's mission. But then it turns nicely when on the next page, and this is almost at the end of the book, Hawk says, even though that mission didn't work out, you still saved lives, and this next thing we'd like you to do is going to save more. So I think for its limitations, that it's not a G.I. Joe comic, it's a pre-G.I. Joe comic, that Phil Noto is a good storyteller, but not an excellent storyteller. And he's not an excellent action artist. His art is not dynamic and exciting. His fight scenes are tepid, and I think there's some odd and weak compositions when he has someone lunging or kicking. But all that said, I think this nicely balances character spotlight, mythology, adding a little bit of new stuff. You could read this if you didn't really know G.I. Joe. Well, actually, you might be confused based on your comments about the flashback and a flashback and a flashback. But, you know, I think my sense when this happened, when this was published, was it's like, oh man, why can't more of the Devil's Due books be like this? You know, like not overcrowded and not, you know, I mean, art as good as this, at least as good as this, you know, color at least as appealing as this. Although it's a very different style, so it's hard to put this, you know, sort of quote better or worse than other coloring. Can I zoom back in on some of the formatting stuff? All right, here's some interesting things I'll call out. Page 1, the background is a photo.
Mm-hmm.
It's a photograph. Yep. And here's another example where I think, okay, Phil Noto is either, you can disagree with me, you know, like, no, Phil Noto must be lazy or untalented if he's going to grab a photo and blow it up so it becomes a like blurry, low resolution photo. I don't love it. I would rather he had drawn that. But two things. One, the composition does work where he's actually placing the Statue of Liberty. And two, he bookends it. So on the first page, there's a photo background. And on the second to last page, there is a photo background. And, you know, cynically, you could say, you know, on that second to last page, the top panel is definitely Phil Noto tracing a photograph, or maybe tracing one photograph of the ferry and another photograph of those buildings. This is the top panel. You could say, well, Tim, he just didn't have time to trace the background and the panel under it. So he just turned off the layer so you could see the photo he's going to trace. And I might buy that, but it sort of feels like because it happens twice, because it happens at the beginning and the end, it's a choice, and I appreciate the choice. Also, you know, Larry Hama has told this anecdote about how Wally Wood, who was sort of his mentor in comics, used to say, I'm going to get this wrong, but used to say, was it don't invent what you can copy, don't copy what you can trace, don't trace what you can, I forget. But it's a cascade of 3 shortcuts.
Never draw anything you can copy, never copy anything you can trace, never trace anything you can cut out and paste up. Yes, thank you. I'm glad it took me so long to stumble through that. So you could Google it, or do you have that memorized? You
No,
just call
Google.
that up from... All right, so you know, I always want artists to draw the hardest thing possible and to do it all by themselves by hand from scratch. But that's not the real world, and generations of illustrators have, you know, all those like splash pages in Fantastic Four or the new or the Fourth World, where Jack Kirby would take a photograph of New York City or outer space and draw some characters on top of it, and then, you know, it like photographs and reproduces as a splotchy, high contrast black and white background that the colorist then colors like normal. You know, Kirby was doing it in the 70s. Okay, so item 1, couple photos show up in backgrounds. Item 2, on pages 10 and 11 and 13 and 16, Noto does this interesting, doesn't quite work thing. So this is, she's a kid, she's doing Taekwondo, or she's doing martial arts with her dad and her brothers. And on page 10, if you're holding the comic book, this is on the left side, you see a young Shauna in the center. And this is the scene that's all like sort of yellowish in flashback, except for all their red hair. In the first 2 panels, on the far left of the panel, you see this like reddish thing come in, and it looks like the edge of a film strip. And then Noto does it again a couple pages later when on page 16,
when her dad has pinned her down and he's lecturing her, and then she walks away and he frowns. And those final 3 panels where she says, "You beat me just because you're older." Noto has the film strip edge come in even more on the left side. And I'm going to press pause on that for a second. In this scene, he's also applied a filter, I think in Photoshop, to all of these panels. And you can tell there's a filter because it's not over the white gutters. It's not over the gaps between panels. That's a clean white paper. But he's adding, it creates a visual noise. And there's some like film scratches and some like hairs, as if we're watching an old film, as if we're looking at old photographs, maybe in a family album. And I appreciate the idea of that. And certainly computer colorists for the last 30 years have been not just using the pure colors in Photoshop, but, you know, making like transparencies of crumpled paper or adding filters in Photoshop to give things grain or texture, make it a little muddy, make it a little dirty, you know, using ink washes or like tea stains on paper to give themselves some kind of texture for the color to sit on, because the color otherwise would be so clean and pure, too clean and too pure. So I like the effect here, but comics aren't film. And if I'm in a movie theater watching a film and I see scratches or hairs on film, my brain accepts it because scratches on film are a real thing and hair on film is a real thing. I don't mean like a wig. I mean like one eyelash. When I read a comic, it's a little intrusive. It's very lightly intrusive to me when you take the like form of one thing and you bring it into another, because comics aren't film. And the other example, this is not here, but when you buy a graphic novel and it has, quote, DVD style bonus features in the back, like script and sketchbook pages, or when a comic book is republished as a, quote, director's cut. Sorry, folks, I think that's dumb. Comic books don't have directors. Films have directors, right? So that's just misusing a word. We all know what it means, but so anyway, back to this this film strip on the left side. The reason why I don't like this, but thank you for trying, Phil Noto. Thank you for playing our game. Is that Phil Noto is using 35mm still camera film, where like you load your camera, like click, wind, and you take a photograph. The edge numbers on like Kodak motion picture film, right? Though it's the same gauge, 35mm, the edge numbers are different, like how they're written and like the shape and size of the sprocket holes. So I think the reference here is supposed to be like movies, but the reference is actually photographs in an old family album. So it's a very nerdy mismatch. Oh yeah, when she's at the Taekwondo tournament and her 3 siblings are at a Duran Duran concert, I mean in the audience watching her tournament, but very fashionable. There are some like vertical scratches down the left side of the panels, and again, like, cool, no, close. Okay, so there's art thing number 2. Number 1 is photos for backgrounds. Number 2 is like comics are comics, not film. I like some of the incorporation of film stuff, but not quite this much.
And some of that idea is something that Phil Noto returns to again and again over his career, of that sort of slightly, nostalgic, maybe like 60s style photography of perhaps the Marvel universe had it existed then, and it's, the cover is a photo. But let's not linger on that. What's point number 3, Tim?
Okay, so on page 31, this is 2/3 the way through the book. They're fighting the Iron Grenadiers. This is when Scarlett gets found out and hit on the back of the head, and then she's unconscious on the ground. Mm-hmm. And this is when Destro shows up in shadow and silhouette, but he's already been revealed. But here's before he gets revealed. In the final panel of this page, the Iron Grenadiers are lifting their arms. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand that. Mark, why are the Iron Grenadiers lifting their arms? Why are they raising their weapons upward? I don't know if this is an art thing or a script thing. Destro says, therefore, effective immediately, I must insist our arrangement come to a conclusion, a termination, if you will. Why are they raising their weapons?
I don't know. Hooray, a termination. I don't know. Mm.
I feel like there's some line in the script that,
Hail Destro!
that either Noto read wrong or the letterer missed or something. Or like something was in an earlier draft of the script and then like got saved. It's like, oh, this is version 3 and I forgot that was in version 2 or version 3.
Yeah, maybe there was, the speech bubbles were sort of spaced out such that there was too much text on bubble 1 and 2. And, bubble number 3 would have been something like, Hail Destro.
Yeah.
But they just run out of space. There was like, we don't have enough space for so many words across 2 speech bubbles. We're going to have to spread them over 3 and lose the original text.
Okay, maybe this is an editing decision.
Mm.
Okay, and then my third sort of art comment is that not only is Phil Noto not entirely interested in or comfortable with drawing 2-point perspective and 3-point perspective. He draws a lot of 1-point perspective. And I know I use these terms all the time in this episode, and without having a pen and a piece of paper and you in front of me, it's hard to do a quick demo. But quickly in words, 1-point perspective, you were looking straight at something. 2-point perspective, you were looking a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right of something. And 3-point perspective, you're looking a little bit to the left or right and a little bit up or a little bit down. On page 17, okay, so this is the page with the car accident. On page 17, there's this panel in the middle where it's an inset panel. It's panel 2 of Scarlett's dad in the wheelchair, and then the sort of camera pulls back for panel 3 of him in the wheelchair in the distance, and she's sort of walking toward him, and her back is to us. And hey, look, it's a straight horizontal line delineating where the floor of the dojo meets the wall, because Phil Noto doesn't want to make that a diagonal because he's not drawing 2 or 3-point perspective. But this is a giant dojo with nothing in it. And on the previous page, I see a door and maybe that same bench and a little shelf and then 2 windows. And one of I think it's sort of halfway a stylistic choice that Phil Noto has good anatomy skills and can compose a panel that is pretty and satisfying even without overloading it with lots of stuff or even loading it with lots of stuff or action. But I do feel like this comic it's like sort of on the wrong side of the line. Like, okay, this needs a few more backgrounds. Like Phil Noto can get away with not a ton of backgrounds here because once you've established the dojo, you can draw a bunch of stuff in the dojo. And we know we're still in the dojo because they're still in their martial arts uniforms and they haven't gone through a door or a portal. And like certainly the 3 panels on the bottom of the page with the car accident, you don't need to draw any backgrounds because it's just head and shoulders of them talking, right? Shot of him, shot of her, and then in profile, them looking at each other and she's looking down at him, right? That's fine. But, like when, all right, so there's item 3, like Phil Noto, I'd like more backgrounds.
I thought your initial observation about that middle panel was that, there's a big guy in a wheelchair, and look to the right, there's another little guy in the wheelchair.
It's not graphically confusing. I wasn't like, why are there 2 of him? It is a little weird.
Yeah, it's not. They've not quite made the that middle panel. That separation maybe quite as clear as it could have been. But
here are 2 small ideas which may help. One, you have the background in the larger panel white.
Yeah.
Because that would. 2, rather than a thin black line for the sort of beige rectangle behind him, you do 2 lines and you make it a white gutter. You use the sort of normal visual for like separation of panels. And then I sort of already covered this. It's maybe sort of rephrasing 3 other half things together. But, if you turn the page back when her siblings are at the Duran Duran concert, and I'm not making fun. I saw Duran Duran recently, and I'm just very excited by how fashionable. Is it her brother's on the left in purple, and then her sister's in the middle, and then her other brother's on the right in gray? Is that what it is?
Are you talking about the panel that says, despite that, they was both the support? I see that as being her mum and her sister.
And okay. And then a stranger. Okay. Right. Yes, because the narration at the bottom of the previous page, she's referring to her
mother and her
mom
sister,
and her sister
being supportive despite not really
right.
being
Okay.
into the whole...
I got thrown off because on the bottom of the previous page, her mom has long hair and her sister has long hair. And then now, a couple years, I guess, 1 year later, they both have shorter hair. And I thought maybe the person wearing the purple jacket looks sort of like the middle brother on the previous page.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry. On this page, at this concert tournament, panel 3, when I guess Scarlett's blocking, and then panel 4, when I think she sort of hopped out of the way when she's in there. She's a green belt fighting a green belt.
Yep.
Not only am I a little unclear on what the actual fight choreography is, that 4th panel on the page where she's behind the blonde and the blonde is doing a sweeping kick, it's not a particularly strong composition, you know? Like, it's all the empty space in the top sort of feels like there want to be 2 word balloons there. It sort of feels like, you know, like the camera wants to angle, like a Dutch angle, like rotate 25 degrees counterclockwise, or and I sort of see this every time Phil Noto has someone like running or lunging or punching. You, at the beginning, much earlier in the show, you referred to page 3 when these guys are yelling, "Get them freckin' Egypts." When the guys are, sorry, I'm reading it phonetically. At the castle at night, these guys are running at the Iron Grenadiers, and you were struck by sort of, well, who are these guys, and like what version of language are they speaking? and I was struck by
empty space in the middle of the page, and if you just pull down the angle slightly a little more, then maybe it'd be more dynamic. Yeah.
So I took a storyboarding class when I was in school, and the teacher was storyboarding professionally at the time on some big deal movies, and he said lower your horizon line. That'll create dynamism. And very soon after, I was like, a couple years later, I was talking with Mike Vosberg at his home, and he'd storyboarded on the G.I.Joe cartoon and was looking at his like photocopy storyboard packet. And I realized the horizon line, like the line if you're inside, the line where like the wall meets the floor, or if you're outside, the actual horizon, like where the mountains sit and the sun sets, those are often not in the shot. They're often below the shot. And what's happening here is in this splash page on page 3 of Scarlett Declassified, the camera is on a tripod, and the camera is at like 10 feet. And we know that because we are taller than these 4 Iron Grenadiers. We can see the tops of their helmets. We're looking down at them. And the horizon line is like it's 3/4 of the way up the page. And if you can't just draw a new line, you have to redraw the perspective of the scene. You have to redraw everyone in it because you'd be seeing their bodies in different perspective. But if you took that line back there where the fires are and you drew it like 1/4 up from the bottom of the page, 1/4 up from the bottom of the page, you would have a lot more power and force to this. And that's just one sort of alternative. That's just one possibility for this page. But, you know, like, compare the, like, blazing death. I know I always go back to Mike's X cover to 47, but Wetsuit and Hawk and Beachhead on the Devilfish, G.I. Joe 47, you know, like the yellow and red coming out of those firearms, and the like tension in their faces, the gritted teeth and the open mouths and the yelling and the sea spray and the diagonals, right? Like, what are the diagonals on this Phil Noto page? There's some very, very, very thin, not even wispy, there's some very, very thin light lines coming out of the Iron Grenadiers' Uzis. And that's it. It's like nothing is diagonal in the smoke, in the poses, in the rubble. The camera's not at a diagonal. And so I get to this page, and this is already after seeing like a very straight like we're looking slightly down at the castle on the previous page, but it's just a straight up and down castle, right? Like compare that. There's no power in that. Compare that. Not a fair comparison, but compare this castle on page 2 of Scarlett Declassified to the first page of Silent Interlude, right? Where that castle is at an angle and drawn in curvilinear perspective, even though I can barely see that, right? I need to look at Larry Hama's like little annotated sketch when he's showing the curved arrows of what he means when he says, "No, I drew this in curvilinear perspective." So I'm very aware of Phil Noto as a cover artist and an artist for like conversations and sneaking, but not fights. And then my last observation about the art, and this is a question, is these Iron Grenadier costumes are a little different. Their masks are different. Do you think, Mark, that this is Phil Noto drawing something simpler just because, or is this like, no, a couple years before what is it, 1988? What year did the Iron Grenadier figures show up? I think it's 88. There's more detail and there's like weird stuff on the red part of their masks. So is this Phil Noto rewinding the clock several years? And like, well, how do I de-evolve the Iron Grenadier costume to when Destro and Mars haven't, developed the gear and the armor and there's not as many like bits? Yeah,
I think so. It's like, the Iron Grenadier when he comes out in 1988, that's the 7th series. And, the designs and the look of the characters is very different to 82 or 83. And so I think it's kind of with that in mind. It's like, well, what if the Iron Grenadier, was there at the beginning or slightly before? It'd be, a simpler or at any rate more different looking design, and maybe sort of taking a bit more of the spirit of some of the look of the Cobras coming out in 1982 and sort of melding them with the look of the Iron Grenadier from 88. So I think it works. It's like a earlier version of the Iron Grenadier design that has continued to evolve, so that when we see them again, they sort of have got certain signifiers that are very similar, but it's definitely not exactly the same design.
Is Noto doing something similar with Destro, who has a simpler costume?
It feels like that, doesn't it? That they're sort of stripping it back and sort of trying to make it. I guess it also probably playing to some of the artistic influences that he likes. The James Bond, Robert McGuinness, the sort of pared back kind of look of that simple polo neck from the 60s, I guess you'd say. Probably playing into it, but yeah, it's not the same Destro that then appeared late, a couple of years later in the early era issues. It's a Destro before that, so you can take some liberties and say that he doesn't look exactly the same as he appears later on.
I always appreciate comics artists who draw Destro's mask looking like a mask. I want it to just be flexible, like on the cartoon, like it's silver skin, like the end of Rise of Cobra. Nanites, everyone, nanites. I want it to be like that because then it's more expressive and the cartoon is so much fun. But the other part of my brain knows that that's unrealistic and that it would be just a mask. At the same time, when it is just a mask, like the live action commercials from 1993, when an actor playing Destro is like threatening the actor playing, Duke, and he's so glad you could join us, ha ha ha, and it's just like a frozen Halloween mask painted silver with a little gap for the mouth. That looks silly. And so this Phil Noto face here is sort of a halfway, and that's sort of where I come. I don't have a solution to this problem, but that's sort of where I come down, which is, I don't want like full eyebrows and cheekbones being able to animate, but I do want some movement, some flexibility, and these sort of planes for the eyebrows for the here's a G.I. Joe reference. Phil Noto's Destro mask looks sort of like Bayok from Deke season 2. And since none of you watched the second season of Deke, that's the end of that reference. Mark, how do you feel about on these pages with Destro, there's this purposeful obstruction of Destro with smoke in front of him that we don't see his face. We hear him, and he's cropped out of the panels. Like when he says circumstances have deemed it necessary. This is that panel where her two partners have beat up faces.
Right.
And then the next panel is just Destro's hand holding his weapon. And then you turn the page and there's another panel of him obstructed by, but also cropped. You don't see it, obstructed by smoke. You don't see his face. And then finally he steps out of the shadows and Destro goes only where he chooses.
Destro only goes where he chooses.
I should have someone from the correct side of the Atlantic try that. I should not try that.
Destro only goes where he chooses. I don't think he's from Glasgow. But and I'm sure other people would say, but that's okay because that definitely wasn't the Glasgow accent, Mark. Okay. So it's interesting. It's sort of like in terms of chronology, this is like Destro's first appearance, ish. And so it's an interesting, it's an interesting reveal. I guess the fact that there's Iron Grenadiers there make it a less surprising reveal, but it's slightly cinematic, isn't it? That he's covered up or slightly off panel, and then he sort of steps forwards, and then you see the reveal of Destro, and potentially that it's Destro isn't so surprising, as I say, given everything that's come before that point. But it's a different look to him, which is maybe the more interesting reveal. It's it's cinematic, but this is comics, so that turn of the page, Destro's head is cropped on that top right panel, but your eyes taking in everything else all at the same time. So it's no mystery really, but. If it was filmed, it would be more of a mystery and more of a reveal.
Yeah, also a little of the effect is diminished when the panel that does reveal him with that line you just did with that amazing accent, the panel has the I don't know what Photoshop calls it, but the like perspective blur where you're sort of like zooming in or zooming out, which I think the effect here is that Destro's sort of taking a step forward. He's sort of rushing us, or the quote camera is like zooming in on him for effect. But because it blurs the panel, it's sort of, the blur ends up kind of doing the same thing that the smoke was doing. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, no, actually what that panel wants is an unencumbered reveal of Destro's face. Like the covered issue 22. Just show me his face. Marvel 22. Show me his face. Destro. Playing with some toys. Shooting up his chess set.
I spy with my little eye.
I've got an I Spy.
I have an I Spy. I bet we have the same I Spy.
So Scarlett's intel gathering squad: Wells, Dino, Monzon, Dove, Mechanic, Billings. Was this the same as yours?
I had 2/5 of your I Spy.
So Wells is obviously Sam Wells, who's credited at the front of this. Dove, it would be Sean Dove from Devil's Due, who also is credited in the front. Art director Sean Dove. Assistant publisher is Sam Wells. I'm not sure who Mechanic and Billings is, but the two other characters, Dino and Monzon, would be a reference to Dino Monzon, who is a G.I. Joe fan, who still to this day posts his thoughts on G.I. Joe. So is a name familiar to me from the likes of Facebook, where I see him posting G.I. Joe content. And I'm sure would have been known to Devil's Due as a letter writer or some such from the day.
I don't think it is the same person. There is a Hasbro employee from that time with the last name Billings, but I don't think a Devil's Due writer was going to toss that in without sort of doing several Hasbro people sort of at the same level. So I think that's a coincidence. I had one last story comment, which is when Scarlett on page 28, when she's on the phone with Sparks, she's undercover in another country and she's on a payphone, and she uses Sparks' first name and Sparks uses her first name. And I know in the current issues of A Real American Hero, written by Larry Hama, everyone's calling Dawn Dawn, and everyone's calling Sean Sean, and not using their code names. But be careful on missions when you are undercover and you're on a payphone using someone's first name. When you're calling the pit on a payphone.
Or even their code name, because that's a bit suspicious.
Actually, that would correct. Yes, that would. Yes.
Although I don't know for sure, without rereading the whole thing back again, whether it's made clear if what name she is going under to these other guys. So whether they would know her as Shauna or not.
Maybe her undercover name is Shauna Real Person.
Shauna, not a disguise.
Shauna. Sorry, I'm blanking on a word. Hold on. You're going to cut this out.
The lesson learned from James Bond is that you just, on any given occasion, you'll just waltz up to someone and introduce them with your actual name.
Her code name on this mission is Shauna Civilian.
Okay. Shall we move to Yo-Joage scoring of this one?
Yeah.
Yo-Jo Cola, not grape soda.
It's Yo-Joage time.
I think it's quite a difficult one to score. I like parts of the story. I like most of the art, and I think this Scarlett Declassified is up there with the high points of the overall Devil's Due era art. And I do remember it, making an impression on me at the time. So I think probably the art would be slightly higher scoring than the rest of it, and so it would probably meet somewhere in the middle. So let's call this a 7.
Yeah, that's a good point. That it would be easier to create a proper rubric where left to right you have 1 to 10, and up and down you have different categories like cover, writing, art, lettering, package design, and then you could do a proper average. I think a lot of my Devil's Due rankings would end up about the same, but it is a little harder to rank this one because I will say that some of my Yo-Joage score for this is that previous Devil's Due comics have been on the low side, and this one was a nice change of pace because the art was so handsome, the story was pretty good and worked by itself, and as a one-shot, there was no risk that like the second issue would be drawn by someone else, or the third issue the story would fall apart. So I will say 6. This is a pretty good comic, but it's definitely elevated by a very handsome cover. It might be a 5, but this is not meant to sound mean, and I know this sounds mean, but at the time and even now, I've been dissatisfied by many of the Devil's Due comics before this, and so this sort of gets an extra push for being more what I want, for being better than them.
Cool. So I think we are all done with Scarlett Declassified. Next time on Talking Joe Disavowed, we will continue our side quest away from the America's Elite book with more of the specials that have been coming out. And next up on our dance card is Dreadnoks Declassified, which was a 3-parter and was collected as a trade. And we should have a special guest joining us for that one. And when we're not talking about the Devil's Due era, you can find us talking about the latest books from Skybound. Looking forward to A Real American Hero as it comes out, as well as Duke, which starts in December, and Cobra Commander, which starts in January. So a whole bunch of G.I.Joe books, which are probably already out by the time you hear this. Amazing. So, Tim, where can people find you when you are not talking to me about G.I.Joe comics?
Video essays from my creative partners and I at our YouTube channel, Atomic Abe Productions. My brick and mortar comic book store in Somerville, Massachusetts is Hub Comics. And I write about G.I. Joe at arealamericanbook.com.
Excellent stuff. You can find more about Talking Joe at the usual places. talkingjoe.co.uk is the website that has links to all of those places. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We're also on Patreon at patreon.com/talkingjoe. So a big thanks to all of our backers: Richard, Sam, Jay, Bill, Christopher, Justin, Rob, Brian, and Shane, who are all getting early access to episodes as well as some exclusive content. And that is us done for now. But remember that
Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
Laters.